Most people believe their emotions belong to them. They believe their anger, frustration, irritation, and anxiety simply appear because of what happens around them. Someone says something rude, and the reaction feels natural. Something goes wrong, and irritation seems unavoidable. A message is ignored, and suddenly the mind starts spinning with assumptions. But pause for a moment and look carefully at what is actually happening. Your mood changes because of strangers. Your peace disappears because of small inconveniences. A comment, a delay, a disagreement, a look from someone across the room, and suddenly your mind is no longer calm. It reacts instantly, almost automatically. The Stoics saw something dangerous in this pattern. They realized that the person who reacts to everything does not control their life. Their peace is constantly negotiated with the world around them. Every opinion, every inconvenience, every unexpected moment has the power to move their mind like the wind moves a leaf. Epictetus warned about this long ago. In the Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 5, he explained that it is not events that disturb us, but the judgments we attach to them. That single insight changes everything. If your reaction is automatic, your peace is fragile. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 47. He reminded himself that the mind becomes colored by the thoughts it repeatedly entertains. In other words, every reaction strengthens the habit of reacting again, and that habit becomes invisible. Most people never question it. They simply react again and again, believing they are responding to life when in reality they are being controlled by it. But the Stoics trained their minds to do something radically different. They learned how to observe before reacting, how to pause before judging, how to remain steady while the world around them moved in chaos. And once you understand this training, something unexpected happens. You begin to see that most reactions were never necessary in the first place. The hidden addiction to reaction. There is a habit controlling the lives of most people, and almost no one notices it. It does not look dangerous. It does not look destructive. In fact, it looks completely normal. The habit is reacting to everything. Someone says something slightly disrespectful, and irritation appears immediately. A message is ignored, and the mind begins creating stories. A small inconvenience appears during the day, and suddenly the mood changes. None of this feels unusual because reacting has become part of daily life. But stop for a moment and look closely at what is really happening. Your emotional state is constantly being negotiated with the world around you. A stranger can affect your mood. A comment online can live in your head for hours. A minor problem can dominate your thoughts for the rest of the day. Without realizing it, your inner peace becomes dependent on external events. The Stoics saw something deeply dangerous in this pattern. They understood that a person who reacts to everything is living under constant external control. Their peace is fragile because it depends on circumstances behaving exactly the way they want. The moment something unexpected appears, the mind loses its balance. Epictetus warned about this long ago. In the Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 5, he wrote that it is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. This observation is simple, yet it reveals a powerful truth. Most reactions are not caused by reality itself. They are caused by the interpretation we attach to reality. The problem is that this interpretation happens so quickly that we rarely notice it. A look from someone becomes disrespect. A delay becomes negligence. A disagreement becomes an attack. The mind immediately labels the situation, and once the label appears, the emotional reaction follows. With repetition, this becomes a habit. The mind begins reacting automatically. No pause, no reflection, no examination of whether the reaction is even necessary. The reaction simply appears, and the person follows it as if it were inevitable. Seneca observed the consequences of this pattern in Letters from Seneca, letter 13. He explained that people suffer far more in their imagination than in reality. The mind creates emotional storms around events that are often small, temporary, and insignificant. But something even more subtle begins to happen over time. The mind starts feeding on the reaction itself. Think about how often people replay a conversation that upset them. Think about how easily a person can spend hours mentally arguing with someone who is not even present. The event is over, yet the reaction continues inside the mind like a fire that keeps finding new fuel. The reaction becomes stimulating. Anger brings energy. Frustration creates intensity. Even irritation gives the mind something to focus on. Slowly, the brain becomes accustomed to this emotional stimulation. It starts searching for new reasons to react, even when nothing truly serious has happened. A small inconvenience becomes a problem. A neutral comment becomes criticism. Silence becomes rejection. The reaction happens so quickly that the person believes it is natural. They believe this is simply how life works. Something happens and you react. That seems obvious. But the Stoics saw this very differently. To them, reacting to everything was not a sign of engagement with life. It was a sign of inner instability. A mind that reacts to every external signal cannot remain steady. It becomes like a boat, constantly pushed by every wave that passes. Marco Aurelio reflected on this in Meditations of Marco Aurelio, Book 8, paragraph 47. He reminded himself that the mind becomes colored by the thoughts it repeatedly entertains. Every reaction strengthens the habit of reacting again. The more you react, the easier reacting becomes. Eventually, the habit becomes invisible. People believe their reactions are simply who they are. They stop questioning them. They stop observing them. They accept them as unavoidable. But this is the moment where the Stoic path begins. Because once you see this habit clearly, something changes. You start noticing how often your mind jumps into reaction mode. You start noticing how quickly your peace disappears over small things. And once you see the pattern, a new question begins to appear. What if reacting was never necessary in the first place? This question opens the door to a deeper realization about the world we live in today and why it constantly pushes us to react faster, louder, and more impulsively than ever before. The illusion of urgency in modern life. There is something unusual about the world you live in today. Almost everything around you behaves as if it were urgent. Messages demand immediate replies. Notifications appear constantly. News travels across the world in seconds. Opinions, criticisms, reactions, and arguments move through screens faster than the human mind was ever designed to process. And slowly, without noticing, the mind adapts to this rhythm. Everything begins to feel important. Everything begins to feel immediate. Everything begins to feel as if it deserves a reaction right now. But here is the quiet truth the Stoics would immediately recognize. Most of these things are not urgent at all. They only appear urgent because the environment around you has trained your attention to respond instantly. A message arrives and the mind feels compelled to answer. A comment appears and the mind wants to defend itself. A piece of news appears and the mind begins forming strong opinions within seconds. This constant demand for reaction creates the illusion that reacting quickly means being attentive, intelligent, or engaged. In reality, it often means the opposite. The Stoics trained themselves to move in a completely different rhythm. They did not allow the speed of events to dictate the speed of their judgment. They understood that the faster the mind reacts, the more likely it is to be controlled by impulse instead of reason. Epictetus spoke about this discipline repeatedly. In the Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 18, he explained that the first step in philosophy is learning to suspend judgment. Before deciding that something is good, bad, offensive, or threatening, the mind must first pause and examine the impression it receives. This pause is exactly what the modern world is constantly trying to eliminate. When everything feels urgent, there is no pause. When there is no pause, there is no reflection. And when there is no reflection, reactions become automatic. Imagine the difference this creates in daily life. A message arrives and you immediately assume something is wrong. A comment appears online and you instantly feel attacked. Someone disagrees with you and the mind prepares its defense before even understanding the other person's intention. The illusion of urgency forces the mind to act before it understands. Marco Aurelio practiced the opposite habit. In Meditations of Marco Aurelio, Book 4, Paragraph 3, he reminded himself to examine every impression carefully before accepting it as truth. He trained himself to slow the mind down even when the world around him moved quickly. This discipline protected his peace. Because when the mind learns to slow down, something surprising begins to happen. Situations that once felt dramatic suddenly appear ordinary. Words that once felt offensive suddenly appear harmless. Events that once triggered anger suddenly lose their emotional charge. You begin to see that many of the things demanding your reaction never deserved your energy in the first place. But there is an even deeper layer to this problem. The speed of modern life does not only create urgency, it also amplifies emotional triggers that the human mind has carried for thousands of years. And once those triggers are activated, the mind can be pulled into reaction before it even understands what is happening. The Stoic observation that changed everything. There is a single observation in Stoic philosophy that quietly changes the way a person experiences life. At first it sounds simple, almost obvious, but once you truly understand it, you begin to see your reactions in a completely different light. The observation is this: events themselves are neutral. What disturbs the mind is the meaning we attach to them. Most people never separate these two things. Something happens, and the emotional reaction appears immediately, as if the event itself carried the emotion inside it. A criticism happens and anger appears. A delay happens and frustration rises. A disagreement happens and the mind feels attacked. But the Stoics trained themselves to notice a hidden step in this process. Between the event and the reaction, there is always a judgment. Epictetus explained this clearly in the Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 5. He wrote that people are not disturbed by things, but by the views they take of those things. This insight seems small at first, yet it exposes the mechanism behind almost every emotional reaction. Something happens. The mind immediately interprets it. Then the emotion follows the interpretation. Consider how often this happens in daily life. A friend responds with a short message. The event itself is simple, just a short message, but the mind interprets it as indifference or disrespect. The reaction appears instantly. Someone looks serious during a conversation. The event itself is neutral, yet the mind interprets the expression as judgment or disapproval. Suddenly tension appears where none existed before. A colleague disagrees with an idea. The event is simply a disagreement, but the mind interprets it as criticism or challenge. The emotional reaction follows immediately. In each case, the reaction feels automatic. It feels as if the event itself caused the emotion. Yet, when you examine it carefully, you see that the reaction followed the interpretation, not the event. This is the Stoic discovery that changes everything. Once you see this pattern, you begin to realize that many emotional reactions are built on assumptions. The mind fills in missing information, assigns motives to other people, and builds entire emotional responses around interpretations that may not even be accurate. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to interrupt this process constantly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 13, he reminded himself that external events have no power over the mind unless the mind grants that power through judgment. This discipline created an extraordinary level of stability. When something unexpected happened, he did not rush to react. He examined the situation first. He asked himself whether the event itself was truly harmful or whether his interpretation was exaggerating the situation. Most of the time, he discovered that the disturbance existed only in the judgment. This realization gives you a powerful advantage. If the reaction is created by interpretation, then the reaction is not inevitable. It can be examined, it can be questioned, it can even be changed. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" the mind begins asking a different question. What interpretation am I adding to this moment? The moment you ask that question, something remarkable happens. The emotional reaction slows down. The automatic response loses some of its power. A small distance appears between the event and your mind, and in that distance, you begin to recover control. But there is another reason why reactions happen so quickly. Something deeper in the human mind is designed to respond emotionally before reason has time to intervene, and understanding that mechanism reveals why even intelligent, disciplined people still find themselves reacting impulsively. How emotional triggers hijack your mind. Even when you understand the Stoic idea that events are neutral, you may still notice something frustrating. Reactions continue to appear. Sometimes they arrive so quickly that reason has no time to intervene. One moment everything is calm, and the next moment irritation, anger, or anxiety has already taken control of your thoughts. This happens because the human mind carries emotional triggers that evolved long before modern life existed. These triggers were originally designed for survival. The brain learned to react quickly to potential threats. When danger appeared, hesitation could be costly. Immediate emotional responses helped human beings defend themselves, escape danger, or protect their place within a group. But the modern world rarely presents the kind of threats these reactions were designed to handle. Instead of physical danger, the mind now reacts to social signals. Criticism, rejection, disagreement, comparison, embarrassment, and uncertainty all activate the same internal alarms that once responded to survival threats. The body reacts before the mind has time to examine the situation. This is why certain experiences trigger strong reactions almost instantly. A harsh comment can feel like a personal attack. A moment of rejection can feel deeply threatening. Being ignored can create discomfort that lingers in the mind long after the moment has passed. These reactions do not happen because the events are truly dangerous. They happen because the mind interprets them as signals that something about your status, identity, or belonging might be at risk. The Stoics understood this mechanism in their own way. They observed that impressions arrive in the mind automatically. The first emotional signal appears before reason has a chance to evaluate it. But they also understood something equally important. The first impression is not the final decision. Epictetus explained this discipline clearly in the Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 18. He taught that when an impression arrives, the mind must pause before agreeing with it. The impression may suggest that something is offensive, threatening, or humiliating, but the wise person does not immediately accept that suggestion. Instead, the mind asks a simple question: is this impression telling the truth? Most people never ask this question. The impression appears and they immediately follow it. If the mind feels insulted, they assume they have been insulted. If the mind feels threatened, they assume something dangerous has happened. The Stoic approach interrupts this automatic process. When the emotional trigger appears, the mind learns to observe it rather than obey it. The feeling may still arise, but the reaction does not need to follow. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 49, he reminded himself to examine each impression carefully and refuse to allow the mind to be carried away by the first emotional response. This discipline creates a powerful shift. The trigger may still appear, but it no longer controls the entire situation. Instead of being dragged by the reaction, you begin observing it with distance. The anger appears, but it does not immediately become action. The frustration appears, but it does not immediately dominate your thoughts. You begin to see the reaction forming rather than becoming the reaction itself. And when that distance appears, something important becomes visible. Many of the reactions you once believed were necessary were simply the mind defending something else entirely. That deeper force is the ego, and it plays a much larger role in human reactions than most people ever realize. The ego's need to defend itself. Many reactions that appear emotional on the surface are actually something deeper. Beneath the irritation, beneath the anger, beneath the sudden urge to defend yourself, there is often a quiet force operating in the background. That force is the ego. The ego constantly tries to protect the image you have of yourself. It wants to appear competent, respected, intelligent, and valued. Whenever something threatens that image even slightly, the mind reacts quickly to defend it. This is why a simple disagreement can suddenly feel personal. Someone questions an idea, and the ego interprets it as a challenge to your intelligence. Someone criticizes your work, and the ego hears an attack on your worth. Someone ignores your message, and the ego begins telling a story about disrespect or rejection. The event itself may be small, but the ego transforms it into something larger because it believes its identity is being threatened. Seneca understood this tendency very well. In Letters from Seneca, Letter 71, he observed that people often become angry, not because of the event itself, but because they feel their importance has been diminished. The ego demands recognition, And when that recognition does not appear, the reaction follows. This process happens quickly and quietly. The mind rarely says directly, "My ego feels threatened." Instead, it creates emotional justifications. The mind says, "That person was rude. That comment was unacceptable. I need to respond. I cannot let that pass." But when examined carefully, many of these reactions are not about justice, truth, or principle. They are about protecting an internal image. Marco Aurelio warned himself repeatedly about this trap. In Meditations of Marco Aurelio, Book 11, paragraph 18, he reminded himself that when another person behaves poorly, the important question is not how to punish them, but how to prevent his own mind from becoming disturbed. For him, protecting inner stability mattered more than defending personal pride. This is a difficult discipline because the ego is subtle. It disguises its motives. It convinces the mind that reacting is necessary. It suggests that silence means weakness and that restraint means surrender. But the Stoics saw the situation differently. They believed that reacting to every perceived offense gives power to the very thing that disturbed you. When the ego takes control, your peace becomes dependent on how other people behave. One careless remark can steal your calm. One disagreement can consume your attention for hours. One moment of disrespect can dominate your thoughts for the entire day. In that state, the ego has already lost the battle. The Stoics practiced a different form of strength. Instead of rushing to defend themselves, they trained the mind to step back from the ego's demands. They examined whether the situation truly required a response or whether the reaction was simply an attempt to protect pride. Often they discovered that the most powerful response required no defense at all, because when the ego becomes quiet, something unexpected becomes possible. The mind gains the ability to remain steady even when others behave poorly, and this reveals one of the most misunderstood forms of strength in Stoic philosophy, the strength of silence, why silence is often the strongest response. Most people believe that reacting proves strength. They believe that answering every criticism, correcting every offense, and defending every opinion shows confidence. When someone challenges them, the instinct is immediate. Respond, explain, argue, win. But the Stoics looked at this habit and saw something different. They noticed that the urge to respond often comes from agitation, not strength. The mind feels disturbed, and the reaction becomes an attempt to restore a sense of control. Words are used to fight discomfort rather than to pursue wisdom. This is why silence is so misunderstood. Silence is often interpreted as weakness. People assume that if someone does not respond to criticism or provocation, it means they were defeated. But the Stoics understood that silence can be the clearest sign of inner stability. A mind that is truly calm does not feel forced to react to everything. Epictetus taught this discipline clearly. In the Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 33, he advised that a person seeking wisdom should be cautious with speech and avoid speaking unnecessarily about themselves or their opinions. The wise person does not rush into conversation simply to defend their position. This restraint protects the mind. Consider how many conflicts in life are fueled by immediate reactions. One person makes a sharp remark. The other answers with irritation. The first person reacts again, now feeling attacked. The exchange escalates, not because the situation required it, but because both minds felt compelled to react. Silence interrupts this cycle. When no reaction appears, the energy of the conflict has nowhere to grow. The moment that could have expanded into a long argument simply dissolves. Marco Aurelio practiced this restraint constantly. In Meditations of Marco Aurelio, Book 6, paragraph 6, he reminded himself that the best response to provocation is often to remain steady and allow the disturbance to pass without becoming involved in it. For him, protecting the peace of the mind mattered more than winning a verbal battle. This kind of silence is not passive, it is deliberate. The mind notices the provocation. The emotional impulse may appear for a brief moment, but instead of obeying it, the person observes it. They allow the urge to react to fade before it turns into words or actions, and something remarkable happens when this discipline becomes stronger. You begin to see how many reactions were unnecessary. You begin to notice how often people attempt to pull you into emotional exchanges that do not improve your life in any meaningful way. The absence of reaction becomes a form of control. Others may raise their voices. Others may attempt to provoke, criticize, or challenge. But when your mind remains steady, their agitation cannot dictate your behavior. This creates a quiet power, because the person who controls their reaction controls the direction of the moment. The person who reacts impulsively surrenders that control immediately. But there is an important skill that makes this discipline possible. Silence alone is not enough. The mind must first learn to create space between what happens and how it responds. That small space changes everything. The moment between stimulus and control. There is a small moment that exists in every human experience. It is quiet, it is brief. Most people pass through it so quickly that they never realize it was there. Yet within that moment lies the difference between reacting automatically and acting with control. Something happens. A word is spoken. A message appears. An unexpected situation interrupts your plans. Immediately the mind receives the stimulus. For most people, the reaction follows instantly. There is no separation between the event and the emotional response. But the Stoics trained themselves to recognize a hidden space in this process. Between what happens and how you respond, there is always a moment where the mind can choose its judgment. This moment may be very small at first. Sometimes it lasts only a second. But once you learn to notice it, that second becomes powerful. It is the place where reason can enter before emotion takes command. Epictetus described this practice clearly in the Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 18. He taught that when an impression appears, the mind must pause and say to itself, "You are only an impression, and not the thing you appear to be." This pause interrupts the automatic acceptance of the impression. Instead of allowing the mind to react immediately, the person observes the thought as it arrives. This observation changes the entire situation. When the mind pauses, it begins asking questions that never appear during an impulsive reaction. Is this situation truly harmful? Am I interpreting this event correctly? Does this moment deserve my energy and attention? Often, the answers reveal something surprising. Many situations that once triggered strong reactions lose their intensity when examined calmly. A comment that seemed offensive turns out to be careless rather than malicious. A delay that felt disrespectful turns out to be simple inconvenience. A disagreement that appeared threatening becomes an opportunity to understand another perspective. Marcus Aurelius practiced this discipline constantly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 29, he reminded himself to stop allowing external impressions to drag the mind into emotional turbulence. He trained himself to pause before agreeing with the first interpretation that appeared. This pause protected his judgment. Without the pause, the mind becomes a servant to impressions. Every emotional signal demands immediate obedience. Anger appears, and the mind expresses it. Frustration appears, and the mind spreads it through words and actions. But when the pause becomes a habit, a new kind of freedom begins to appear. You begin to notice your reactions forming before they fully develop. The irritation rises, but you see it. The defensive thought appears, but you examine it. The urge to respond quickly is present, yet you no longer feel compelled to follow it. This moment between stimulus and response becomes a place of awareness. And the more often you enter that space, the more control you gain over your own mind. Situations that once controlled your mood begin to lose their power. Reactions that once felt unavoidable begin to feel optional. But there is another trap waiting for the mind, even after this pause becomes stronger. Because sometimes the reaction is not triggered by the event itself, but by the meaning the mind invents around it. And that meaning is often wrong. The misinterpretation trap. One of the most common reasons people react emotionally has very little to do with reality itself. It has to do with the story the mind quickly builds around what it sees. The human mind dislikes uncertainty. When information is incomplete, it fills the gaps automatically. It creates explanations, assigns motives, and constructs meanings that may not actually exist. This process happens so quickly that it feels like truth. A message receives a short reply and the mind assumes the other person is annoyed. A colleague passes by without greeting and the mind interprets it as disrespect. Someone disagrees during a discussion and the mind immediately labels it as an attack. In each situation, the event itself is simple, but the interpretation creates the emotional reaction. The Stoics observed this habit long before modern psychology described it. They understood that the mind constantly adds meaning to neutral events, and once that meaning is accepted as truth, the emotional reaction follows automatically. Epictetus warned about this tendency in the Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 27. He explained that people often confuse their interpretation of events with the events themselves. When the mind does this, it reacts to its own assumptions rather than to reality. This is the misinterpretation trap. The mind believes it is responding to facts, but it is actually responding to a story it created within seconds. Think about how often this happens in everyday life. A friend does not answer your call. The mind quickly begins constructing reasons. Perhaps they are upset with you. Perhaps you did something wrong. Perhaps they are avoiding you. The imagination becomes active, and before long the emotional reaction appears. Later, you discover that the person simply left their phone in another room. Nothing about the original event required the emotional reaction that followed. The reaction was created entirely by interpretation. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to avoid this mistake constantly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 7, he reminded himself to remove the opinion that something is terrible and the disturbance disappears. In other words, when the mind stops exaggerating or misreading a situation, the emotional reaction loses its foundation. This discipline requires patience. The mind must learn to question its first explanation. When an event occurs, instead of immediately accepting the interpretation that appears, the Stoic asks a different question. What do I actually know about this situation? Often the answer is surprisingly little. Most reactions are built on incomplete information. The mind fills the empty spaces with assumptions, and those assumptions generate emotional responses that shape the rest of the day. But when the habit of questioning interpretations becomes stronger, a new clarity appears. You begin to notice how often the mind rushes to conclusions. You begin to see how many reactions were triggered not by reality, but by imagination. Situations that once felt personal begin to appear neutral. This clarity weakens the power of impulsive reactions. Because when you stop believing every interpretation your mind produces, you regain the ability to examine events calmly before responding. And once that calm examination becomes a habit, another powerful skill begins to develop. The ability to reshape how you see every situation. The Stoic skill of emotional reframing. Once the mind learns to question its first interpretation, a powerful ability begins to emerge. The ability to change the meaning of a situation before the emotional reaction takes control. The Stoics practiced this skill constantly, and it became one of the most effective ways to protect their inner stability. Most people assume that the meaning of an event is fixed. Something happens and they believe the emotional conclusion is obvious. A mistake means failure. A criticism means insult. A delay means disrespect. The mind accepts the first interpretation that appears and reacts accordingly. But the Stoics discovered something important. The meaning of an event is often far more flexible than it first appears. A situation that seems negative can be examined from another angle. A moment that looks like an obstacle may contain an opportunity to practice patience, discipline, or understanding. When the mind changes the way it sees the event, the emotional reaction changes with it. Epictetus described this mental discipline in the Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 6. He explained that it is not circumstances themselves that disturb people, but the way those circumstances are interpreted. If the interpretation changes, the emotional response changes as well. This is the essence of emotional reframing. Instead of allowing the first interpretation to dominate the mind, the Stoic deliberately searches for a more balanced perspective. When someone criticizes you, the mind asks whether the criticism might contain something useful. If it does, it becomes an opportunity to improve. If it does not, then it becomes something that can be ignored without emotional disturbance. Either way, the reaction loses its power. Marcus Aurelius practiced this method frequently. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 5, paragraph 20, he reminded himself that every obstacle in life can become material for virtue. Difficult people become opportunities to practice patience. Delays become opportunities to practice calm. Discomfort becomes an opportunity to strengthen resilience. By reframing events in this way, he removed their ability to control his emotions. This does not mean pretending that negative experiences do not exist. The Stoics never suggested ignoring reality. Instead, they trained the mind to respond to reality in a way that preserved inner strength rather than weakening it. Consider how different a situation feels when the interpretation changes. A mistake can be viewed as humiliation, or it can be seen as feedback that helps you grow. A difficult conversation can be seen as conflict, or it can be viewed as a chance to understand another perspective. A challenge can be seen as unfair, or it can be seen as training for the mind. The event remains the same, but the meaning transforms the experience. This is why emotional reframing is such a powerful discipline. It returns authority to the mind. Instead of reacting to the situation imposed by the world, you begin choosing the perspective that allows you to remain steady. Over time, this practice creates an unexpected advantage. Situations that once triggered irritation begin to feel manageable. Moments that once caused anger begin to feel like training. Events that once disturbed your peace begin to strengthen it. And when the mind becomes capable of maintaining calm in difficult moments, something remarkable happens. Calmness itself begins to influence the people around you. How calmness disrupts conflict. Most conflicts do not begin with great problems. They begin with small reactions that quickly grow larger. A sharp tone appears, a defensive reply follows. One person reacts, then the other reacts even more strongly. Within minutes, a simple situation becomes a tense exchange filled with emotion. This escalation happens because emotional reactions feed each other. When one person reacts with anger or irritation, it creates pressure on the other person to respond in the same emotional tone. The atmosphere changes immediately. Voices become sharper, words become less thoughtful. Each reaction adds more intensity to the moment. But something remarkable happens when calmness enters the situation. Calmness interrupts the chain of reaction. When one person refuses to respond emotionally, the conflict loses much of its energy. The tension that would normally expand begins to collapse. Without the expected reaction, the emotional momentum cannot continue growing. The Stoics understood this dynamic very well. Seneca examined the nature of anger in his work, On Anger by Seneca, Book 1, Chapter 8. He explained that anger spreads rapidly between people because it provokes imitation. When one person displays anger, it invites the other person to mirror that behavior. But when calmness replaces anger, the cycle of escalation weakens. Calmness removes the fuel from the fire. Consider how unusual it feels when someone remains composed during a heated moment. Instead of raising their voice, they listen. Instead of defending themselves aggressively, they respond with patience. Instead of reacting immediately, they pause and consider their words. This behavior often surprises the other person. The emotional intensity they expected to meet is not there. The confrontation they prepared for does not unfold in the way they imagined. In many cases, the tension fades simply because the calm response prevents the conflict from growing. Marcus Aurelius practiced this discipline in his own life as a leader. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 11, paragraph 18, he reminded himself that the best response to people who behave poorly is to avoid becoming like them. If someone speaks with anger, the wise response is not to mirror that anger. Instead, the mind remains steady. This stability creates influence. When calmness becomes your default response, others begin adjusting their behavior around it. Emotional confrontations lose their impact because they cannot provoke the reaction they expect. Situations that once turned into arguments now dissolve more quickly. Calmness becomes a quiet form of authority. It shows that your actions are not controlled by the emotional behavior of others. You respond according to your own judgment rather than according to the pressure of the moment. Over time, this discipline changes the way people interact with you. They begin to realize that provoking you will not produce the reaction they seek. They begin to see that emotional pressure cannot easily disturb your state of mind, and when that realization appears, many conflicts never even begin. But there is another challenge that often disturbs the mind even when no direct conflict exists: the quiet influence of other people's opinions. And unless the mind learns to detach from that influence, reactions will continue to appear in subtle ways. The power of detaching from opinions. Many reactions do not come from what people say directly. They come from what we imagine people are thinking about us. The human mind has a deep sensitivity to social judgment. It constantly tries to evaluate how others see us, whether we are respected, accepted, admired, or criticized. This sensitivity creates a powerful source of emotional reactions. A person may not insult you openly, yet the possibility that they disapprove of you can disturb your thoughts. A stranger may express an opinion online, and suddenly the mind feels the need to defend itself. A room may fall silent after you speak, and the mind immediately begins searching for signs of judgment. In many of these moments, nothing harmful has actually happened. What disturbs the mind is the importance given to the opinions of others. The Stoics recognize this as one of the most common traps that weakens inner stability. When your peace depends on how others evaluate you, your emotional state becomes fragile. Every comment, every look, every opinion becomes a potential disturbance. Epictetus warned about this problem with remarkable clarity. In the Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 29, he advised that if a person wishes to live wisely, they must accept that they will sometimes appear foolish or strange in the eyes of others. The moment you begin living according to your own judgment, rather than the expectations of the crowd, criticism becomes inevitable. But criticism loses its power when you stop depending on approval. Most reactions exist because the mind seeks validation. It wants to feel respected. It wants confirmation that it belongs and that its ideas are accepted. When that validation does not appear, the reaction follows. The Stoics trained themselves to loosen this dependency. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that the opinions of others are fleeting and often inconsistent. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 12, paragraph 4, he reflected on how quickly the judgments of people change and how little control we have over them. One day, someone praises you. The next day, they criticize you. Another day, they forget about you entirely. If your peace depends on these shifting opinions, stability becomes impossible. But when the mind detaches from the need for approval, something important changes. The emotional weight attached to other people's views begins to fade. Praise becomes pleasant but not necessary. Criticism becomes information rather than injury. This creates a new kind of freedom. You begin to act according to what is reasonable rather than according to what will be most admired. Decisions become clearer because they are no longer filtered through the fear of judgment. Reactions become less frequent because the mind no longer feels personally threatened by every opinion it encounters. This does not mean ignoring feedback or rejecting the perspectives of others. Wisdom still requires listening and learning. But the difference is that your emotional balance no longer depends on their approval. Their opinions remain outside your control, and the Stoics believed that anything outside your control should never determine your peace of mind. When this discipline becomes stronger, the mind starts noticing something interesting. Many things that once triggered reactions only had power because you gave them attention. And once you learn to control where your attention goes, an entirely new level of mental discipline begins to develop. The mental discipline of selective attention. The human mind has a remarkable ability that most people rarely use consciously. It has the power to decide what deserves attention and what does not. This ability seems simple, yet it determines how peaceful or chaotic the mind becomes throughout the day. Most reactions begin with attention. Something small appears in your environment. A careless remark, a negative comment, a minor inconvenience, an unpleasant tone in someone's voice. The mind notices it, focuses on it, and begins analyzing it. Within seconds, the situation expands in your thoughts. The attention you give it becomes the fuel that allows the reaction to grow, but the Stoics trained themselves to guard their attention carefully. They understood that not every event deserves space inside the mind. Not every comment requires analysis. Not every inconvenience requires emotional investment. When the mind learns to choose what it focuses on, many reactions disappear before they even begin. Epictetus emphasized this discipline repeatedly in the Discourses of Epictetus, Book 4, Chapter 4. He taught that people should be careful about what impressions they allow to occupy their minds. If the mind constantly focuses on trivial irritations and distractions, it gradually becomes restless and reactive. Attention shapes the emotional landscape of the mind. Think about how often people replay minor events throughout the day. A short conversation is repeated in memory. A critical remark is examined from every possible angle. An awkward moment is revisited again and again. Each repetition strengthens the emotional reaction attached to it. Yet most of these events lose their importance quickly when the mind refuses to dwell on them. Marcus Aurelius practiced this discipline intentionally. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 3, Paragraph 16, he reminded himself that the mind should not scatter its attention across unnecessary thoughts. Instead, it should remain focused on what is meaningful and under personal control. When attention becomes disciplined, reactions lose much of their power. A careless comment may still appear, but it does not capture the mind for hours. An inconvenience may happen, but it does not dominate your thoughts for the rest of the day. The event passes through your awareness and then fades because you chose not to give it prolonged attention. This ability creates a surprising level of calm. Many disturbances that once seemed unavoidable begin to disappear simply because the mind no longer feeds them with constant focus. Situations that once felt overwhelming reveal themselves as temporary and unimportant. Selective attention becomes a quiet form of protection. Instead of allowing every external signal to occupy your mind, you begin choosing which experiences deserve your energy. Over time, this choice becomes automatic. The mind naturally releases small irritations rather than holding on to them. But developing this discipline requires another important change. The speed of the mind itself must slow down, because when the mind moves too quickly, it jumps from one reaction to the next before attention has the chance to guide it. Training the mind to slow down. One of the quiet reasons people react so often is the speed of their thoughts. The mind moves quickly from one impression to the next. Something happens and the reaction appears almost instantly. There is no space for reflection because the mind has already rushed forward. Modern life quietly reinforces this speed. Information arrives constantly. Messages appear without pause. Conversations happen rapidly. The mind becomes accustomed to processing everything immediately, as if every situation required a fast response. But the Stoics understood that clarity rarely appears in a hurried mind. When thoughts move too quickly, judgment becomes shallow. The mind accepts its first interpretation without examining it. Emotional reactions form before reason has time to evaluate whether the situation deserves that response. Slowing the mind down changes this entire process. When the mind becomes slower and more deliberate, impressions lose their ability to dominate instantly. Instead of reacting automatically, the mind observes the situation for a moment longer. That small delay allows reason to examine what is happening before emotion takes control. Epictetus described this discipline through constant mental training. In the Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 1, he explained that the mind must be trained to examine impressions patiently rather than rushing into agreement with them. A wise person does not accept the first appearance of a situation as truth. They pause and investigate it. This pause becomes easier when the mind is not rushing through every experience. Marcus Aurelius practiced this deliberate pace throughout his life. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 24, he reminded himself that the mind must not be dragged around by sudden impulses. Instead, it should remain steady, observing events with calm attention before responding. This steady rhythm protects the mind from unnecessary reactions. Consider how different a situation feels when you slow down your thinking. A comment that once provoked immediate irritation now appears less significant when examined calmly. A disagreement that once triggered defensiveness becomes an opportunity to listen more carefully. The situation itself does not change. What changes is the space your mind creates before responding to it. This discipline also reduces the emotional noise that often fills daily life. When the mind moves too quickly, it carries fragments of many experiences at once. Thoughts jump between past conversations, future worries, and present distractions. This mental turbulence makes reactions more likely. But when the mind learns to move with calm attention, that turbulence begins to settle. Events are examined one at a time. Thoughts become clearer. Emotional impulses lose their urgency. The mind becomes less vulnerable to the constant pull of external disturbances. Over time, this slower rhythm creates something rare in the modern world, a mind that is not easily rushed. And when the mind is no longer rushed, it begins to experience a form of independence that many people never discover, a freedom that appears when reactions no longer control your inner state, the inner freedom of non-reactivity. When the mind stops reacting to everything, something unexpected begins to appear. At first, it is subtle. Situations that once disturbed you pass by more quietly. Words that once stayed in your mind for hours lose their weight. Moments that once triggered irritation no longer dominate your thoughts. This change is not caused by the world becoming calmer. The world remains unpredictable. People continue to speak carelessly. Problems continue to appear. Delays, disagreements, misunderstandings, and inconveniences still happen. The difference is that your inner state is no longer controlled by these events. Most people live with a fragile sense of peace. Their calm depends on circumstances behaving the way they expect. When the environment is comfortable and predictable, the mind feels stable. But the moment something unexpected happens, that stability disappears. This is why reactions feel so powerful. They expose how dependent the mind is on external conditions. The Stoics sought a different kind of stability. They wanted a form of inner freedom that did not depend on the behavior of others or the comfort of circumstances. This freedom appeared when the mind learned to stop reacting impulsively to every impression that arrived. Epictetus described this independence with remarkable clarity. In the Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 19, he explained that the person who seeks freedom must understand what is truly under their control and what is not. External events, other people's opinions, and unexpected circumstances remain outside our control. But our judgments, our responses, and our character remain within it. When a person understands this distinction deeply, reactions begin to fade. An insult may appear, but the mind recognizes that the insult itself does not control its response. A problem may arise, but the mind understands that frustration does not solve the problem. A disagreement may occur, but the mind no longer treats every opposing view as a threat. The inner state remains steady because it is no longer dependent on external approval or comfort. Marcus Aurelius practiced this perspective constantly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 48, he reminded himself that if something external causes distress, the disturbance does not come from the event itself, but from the judgment about it. And because that judgment belongs to the mind also has the ability to release it. This insight creates a quiet sense of power. When reactions disappear, your energy is no longer scattered across small irritations and unnecessary conflicts. Attention returns to what truly matters. Decisions become clearer because they are not driven by emotional pressure. Relationships become calmer because conversations are not constantly shaped by defensive reactions. The mind becomes stable in a way that many people never experience. This stability is not coldness, and it is not indifference. The Stoics never encouraged emotional emptiness. Instead, they encouraged emotional mastery. Feelings still appear, but they no longer dominate the mind or dictate behavior. This mastery creates space for patience, understanding, and thoughtful action, and when a person reaches this level of calm, something profound becomes visible. True strength has nothing to do with controlling other people or controlling circumstances. True strength is the ability to remain steady regardless of what happens around you. This realization leads to the final step in the Stoic path, a step that reveals the deeper purpose behind learning not to react to everything. The Stoic path to unshakable peace. When people first hear the Stoic idea of not reacting to everything, they often misunderstand it. They imagine a person becoming distant, unemotional, or indifferent to the world. They imagine someone who suppresses feelings and withdraws from life. But this was never the Stoic goal. The Stoics were not trying to remove emotion from life. They were trying to remove the chaos that uncontrolled reactions bring into the mind. Their goal was not coldness. Their goal was stability. Because a stable mind can live more fully than a reactive one. A reactive mind spends its energy constantly responding to small disturbances. It reacts to criticism, reacts to inconvenience, reacts to disagreement, reacts to delays, reacts to opinions. Its peace rises and falls depending on what happens throughout the day. But the Stoics trained themselves to build something far stronger than temporary emotional balance. They built inner authority. This authority begins with a simple understanding. The world will always contain unpredictable people, unexpected problems, and uncomfortable situations. No amount of effort will remove these things from life. Trying to control them completely only creates frustration. What can be controlled is the mind that responds to them. Epictetus built his philosophy around this principle. In the Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 1, he explained that some things are within our control and others are not. When people confuse these two categories, they suffer unnecessarily. They waste energy reacting to events they cannot change. But when this distinction becomes clear, a new way of living becomes possible. You stop demanding that the world behave according to your expectations. You stop treating every inconvenience as a personal injustice. You stop allowing other people's behavior to dictate your inner state. Instead, you return your attention to the only territory that truly belongs to you: your judgment, your actions, your character. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this discipline repeatedly while ruling one of the largest empires in history. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 30, he reminded himself that external events cannot disturb the mind unless the mind allows them to do so. The power to maintain peace always remained within his own reasoning. This understanding creates an extraordinary form of calm. You still face challenges. You still experience difficult conversations. You still encounter moments of tension and uncertainty, but those moments no longer control the direction of your thoughts. Instead of reacting automatically, you respond deliberately. Instead of being pulled by every disturbance, you remain steady in your principles. Over time, this discipline transforms the way life feels. Small irritations lose their influence. Other people's opinions lose their authority over your emotions. Conflicts lose their ability to dominate your thoughts. The mind becomes quieter, clearer, and more focused on what truly matters. And in that quiet clarity, something rare appears. A peace that does not depend on perfect circumstances. A peace that remains even when the world becomes difficult. This was the peace the Stoics pursued throughout their lives. Not the peace of escaping the world, but the peace of mastering the mind within it. Because the person who no longer reacts to everything has discovered something powerful. They have discovered that the greatest control a person can achieve is not over the world around them, it is over themselves.